would say good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the first session around the theme focused on research lens on advanced data sources. The first session, as a part of this theme, is focused on introducing manufacturing data and how it integrates with RWE. A little bit about this session. A lot of us within the RWE community talk about various disparate data sources, including claims, EHR, even IoT, patient-reported outcomes. But I personally, after having worked for more than 10 years in this sector, have had very limited interaction and knowledge about what all data can come from the manufacturing side of the house and how can it drive insights into influencing product life cycle, safety, and patient outcomes. So today, with Dr. Bob, we thought that we will touch upon this interesting topic. In my past interactions with him, I've learned that this in itself is a subject which can fulfill an entire event. But we thought that at least for our audience, this will be a starting point, our entry into what this subject looks like. To introduce the speaker, Dr. Bob, Bob is a principal at BioPharma Data and Manufacturing Systems Consulting LLC. He's been working in the life sciences industry for past 38 years with a primary focus on data management. He has worked for preclinical research labs, biotech manufacturing companies, and software vendors, including Siemens and Emerson. His current company is focused on data roadmaps, lab and manufacturing data systems, and data integrity. Thank you so much, Dr. Bob, for being here. Over to you for the session.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So let me find the presentation. I'm not seeing where to pull up the presentation, Saurav. Oh, there we go. Great. Okay, so as Saurav mentioned, what we're going to be starting with today is to look at manufacturing data and how it integrates with real-world evidence. And when I say integrate, I'm not talking about the technical aspects of the integration, but rather how it integrates organizationally and over the course of the product lifecycle where there might be opportunities. And manufacturing data and real-world evidence are becoming intertwined, and they do require some common solutions. So what I'm going to try to do is introduce you a little bit to the some of the particular data challenges in manufacturing the data sources, and then talk about how they'd be relevant to this conversation. I'm going to start with a story. I'm currently engaged with a biotech company, and we're working on some data integrity issues. And I'm going to talk more about data integrity in manufacturing in a couple minutes. But as we were going through and looking at how to strengthen their policies and procedures, their approach to data collection and data preservation and data review for manufacturing, some of the people in the room who were in clinical pulled aside the team lead and said, we need to have this same conversation, because while we do different data, the rules and policies that you're putting in place make a lot of sense for us too. And we're not sure that we would be able to manage the data integrity in the same way without approaching it in the same way. So just internally, that at that particular company, they recognize that there are approaches and solutions that need to be integrated in order to make the two work together. So I'm going to start real quickly, or start with the manufacturing and just give a sense of where the data in manufacturing is. As Saurav mentioned, there are a lot of data sources in manufacturing. There's the collection of information from equipment, how the equipment is running, how the equipment is processing, what's currently running on the equipment. There's information about the batches being produced. There's lab information about the testing that's performed. There are environmental monitoring data. And there are a lot of data sources. And one of the things that has become an opportunity in manufacturing is to leverage large data sets, to be able to aggregate data that were previously held in databases inside individual systems, to move them over to larger data sets, and then to apply analytic tools to those. A second innovation in data that's been enabled by current technology in manufacturing is the creation of digital twins, a virtual copy of your manufacturing facility that allows you to go in and to run scenarios against that digital twin to start to make some uh, adjustments if required, or optimizations to your manufacturing without actually touching the equipment. So again, those digital twins require large data sets in order to have a lot of validity. The third challenge, much more recent, and one that the FDA, for example, has not completely figured out yet, but there are discussions already underway, is how to manage artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I think this is a good place to talk about the connection to real world evidence, in that as a new way of approaching data, and new way of approaching data sources and how we do the analytics on data, the AI and machine learning component for manufacturing is a real challenge. In the old systems, they were well-bounded, validated systems inside a usually single piece of software that might be spanning multiple pieces of equipment, but is a relatively closed system. But the artificial intelligence and machine learning are going to be better in terms of optimizing manufacturing if there's the opportunity to leverage greater data sets than are available inside those small boxes. The move to artificial intelligence and machine learning raises two relatively significant issues for those types of data tools that are going to be connected to data integrity, which I'll talk about next, as well as potentially provide a good analog to real world evidence. The first one is the concept of provenance, the record trail that tells where did this piece of data come from, and an explanation for how and why it got to the present place. So provenance is about, what is this piece of data? Where did it come from? How did it get here? And when we talk about in manufacturing, how did it get here? Was there transformations of the data required, manipulations of the data required, conversions, something as simple as that, unit of measure conversions. But as it got here, how did it get here? And that concept of provenance is important as you start to apply artificial intelligence and machine learning tools in manufacturing. The second is that those tools are based upon models. And those models are going to be the thing that gets adjusted during the course of manufacturing as the AI and ML tools are being applied. And that requires some sense of the credibility of those models themselves. And that requires verification of software code, of calculations, validation of the model itself, and then some mechanism for tracking the versions and evolution of those models as they're being optimized during the course of the application of the tools. In a traditional manufacturing setting, let's say I had a batch record for how I would go through and make my product. If I made a change to a step, I would have a version control and an approval process that would say, I went from version 1 to version 2, here's what was changed, here's the approvals for it. With AI and ML models, what needs to happen there is some similar type of idea of control in order to be able to say that there is a credibility to those predictions. And I think that idea of approaching a different type of provenance and credibility, I think has a lot of connection to real world evidence as we start to draw some connections between RWE and manufacturing. The final real key point in data evolution and manufacturing, and the one that relates to that story I told at the very beginning, is the regulatory requirements for data integrity. At the simplest level, the regulatory agencies are saying that you need to be able to have complete control of your data and a complete understanding of that data in a risk-based approach that says, I understand, based on my knowledge of my process, my knowledge of this data, what it is, where it came from, and how it's being used. And also, equally importantly in manufacturing, how it's being preserved. And it's not only the data, but the metadata, something very similar to that idea of provenance that I already talked about with AI. How did it get here, and where did it originally come from? And that part of the metadata is important for data integrity as well. I'm very quickly just going to introduce a concept related to data integrity as it's applied in manufacturing. It's called Alcoa++. So the original Alcoa is based on the letters of that phrase. The first is attributable, the idea that we need to know who did this or what system did this. It needs to be attributable in some clear and precise way. That too connects to that idea of provenance that I talked about in AI and ML. And as you might imagine, has a lot of implications for real world evidence as well. Where did I get this data from? And that's going to help me determine its credibility and how I'm going to be able to use it. The L in Alcoa stands for legible. The data needs to be readable. It needs to be contemporaneous. As you might imagine, that's going to be a significant challenge if you're talking real-world evidence being brought into the same landscape, in that a lot of things that are going to be collected are retrospective, somebody going back and giving you their medical history, somebody saying, yes, I had this condition 10 years ago. In a manufacturing space, that is absolutely a toxic idea. The idea that we would ask somebody, what did you do 10 minutes ago, as opposed to somebody recording it at the very moment at which they do it. And so this idea of contemporaneous is going to be a challenge in terms of using real world evidence in any way that would amount to compliance with Alcoa. And you'll need to think about how you're going to manage that process. The data needs to be original, the O in Alcoa, and accurate. The Alcoa Plus then adds a few more concepts, the first of which is the data needs to be complete. And when we say complete, it doesn't mean it needs to be all of the data. It means if it's a restricted data set, we need to have some mechanism for saying, here's why we believe this subset of the data still represents the complete data set. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be enduring, and it needs to be available. The final concept, the Alcoa Plus Plus, something that the EMEA has started to focus on, which is traceability. And this goes back to that same concept of provenance that I talked about with AI and ML tools. It's traceable through the process lifecycle, including all of the changes that were made to it. So those are some of the current spaces where manufacturing is in its data path. So in terms of why we would want to potentially start to connect RWE and manufacturing, there are two primary reasons. The first is this idea that the patient is, if not the therapy, maybe the raw material for the therapy, but because of that, in cell and gene therapy, the evidence that we have about the patient is also going to be relevant to the manufacturing process when we're doing personalized cell and gene therapy. That's going to create a whole new challenge for us. Amy Abernethy, who's the former deputy commissioner of the FDA, talked about how cell and gene therapies are going to force us into a new data space, combining manufacturing data with real-world efficacy and safety. And so we need to be prepared for how we're going to approach this collision of these two data sets, and cell and gene therapy is a great place to do this. A key consideration is also the transparency. That one of the challenges, and we'll talk about this in an upcoming slide, is that while the patient specific information is going to be a good combination of real world evidence, what's the patient's outcome from this therapy, and the tracking of the actual therapy itself, since it's patient specific, there are going to be some challenges, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The second reason why we want to talk about real world evidence in manufacturing is how we bring that manufacturing data back into real world evidence. One of the customers I've worked with recently got a regulatory approval to change their personalized medicine process from a 7-day process to a 5-day process. One of the things we might want to look at over time is how does that patient's outcome vary based on this decision, so that other companies looking to do a similar type of regulatory filing to change the process, and the advantage to the patient of improving that throughput by 28% is enormous, as is the advantage to the company, being able to have a 28% higher throughput. So being able to go from 7 days down to 5, if their patient outcome can be tracked, and that's going to become real world evidence. That's not going to be tracked in controlled manufacturing systems. It's going to bring those two data sets together in a way that might help other regulatory filings for a change to the manufacturing process. So there's manufacturing data being brought back into the real world evidence as part of the large data set, especially when we're looking at patient-specific therapies. All right, so I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time here talking about the challenges. So first, the challenges for manufacturing. And so as we look at the manufacturing, probably one of the biggest challenges is data integrity. So as we look at data integrity for manufacturing, we are looking at these various data sets, and we're looking at operations that include transcription, interfaces between systems, transformations of data, analytics tools applied across multiple data sets. And we need to have all of that data integrity put in place. We need to have that Alcoa ++ framework for holding that data in place. And so the systems that are currently being used also need policies and procedures that are written about the governance of how we put in new systems, how we connect systems, how we track data as it moves from one system to another. when we can decide that data has reached the end of its data life cycle and we could potentially remove it from the data set. So all of these issues are going to be challenges for manufacturing. A big one is the use of, as I mentioned earlier, the AI and ML tools. There is a kind of collision between that concept of provenance, where did this data come from and how did it get here, and those two Alcoa Plus principles of attributability and traceability. And those two things are very highly connected. They're a challenge that needs to be put into the framework for how we do AI and ML. And at the same time, they're also a data integrity challenge for the batch that I'm producing right now. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, another of the challenges for manufacturing is a similar idea to what happens in real world evidence, is that we don't always know necessarily the patient information. But in the case of a patient-specific manufacturing therapy, we do know that this therapy is specific to a patient. So we can start to look at things in manufacturing that might be relevant to improving the process based on patient outcomes. We might find that titers vary from patient to patient, and that might allow us to make changes to the manufacturing process once we get a large enough data set, both in terms of those titers and the eventual patient outcomes. The flip side of that is, as we start to manufacture new products, we can leverage that evidence on the patient outcomes as well and potentially modify the processes. But what's limited in manufacturing is the ability to connect that patient therapy to a patient outcome. The same challenge that other real-world evidence initiatives face, which is the ability to preserve patient privacy and yet be able to connect data to individuals in a clear and precise way, so that you know that the data that you're working with, where it came from, and what it's going to be used for, that concept of provenance, that concept of traceability. Then there are the challenges for real-world evidence. Much like in manufacturing, you've got disparate data sets, you've got data integrity issues. Once you start to bring that into a decision-making process, you need to be able to, much as in manufacturing, preserve that decision-making process. You also have the complication for data integrity in real-world evidence, in that what you're looking at is potentially data that in some way needs to be adjusted based on the fact that, for the most part, real-world evidence, therapeutic choices are not random. That what we typically are looking at in real-world evidence is a physician choosing a therapy for a patient, and all of you are familiar with that idea, and how that, to a certain degree, moves beyond this idea of randomization. So while in manufacturing, we're looking at very precise controls, and we want to be able to make sure that everything is in a controlled situation, and thus apply the data integrity over the top, there are some challenges for real-world evidence in doing that. So let's take a step then and talk about data governance. So data governance is this overarching idea that encompasses data integrity. How do I collect and preserve and trace and review my data? But also includes, what are the rules and procedures for how I manage that data organizationally, systemically inside the systems? How do I govern the access to healthcare information, especially when I'm doing patient-specific therapies? So part of the idea of data governance is that we need an approach to this, and the approach needs to be an approach that applies across the organization. We can't handle data one entirely different way in manufacturing and then a totally different way in our clinical practices. We need to say, if we're saying data has to be preserved, it needs to be preserved with the same types of rules. Maybe not the exact same rule. The timing of retention may be radically different between a batch, when I might need to preserve it for a year beyond the expiry of the batch, versus clinical data that I might need to preserve for decades, especially in some therapeutics. Patient outcomes, if they're successful, may be running out into decades. So the actual application of the rules might be different, but the rules need to be similar. We need to be able to say, going back to this concept of provenance, where did my data come from? How did it get here? And what may have been done to it in the process of getting it from here to there. So there's going to be some challenges. And for real world evidence too, there's challenges in terms of the lack of harmonization that still exists out there. We are talking large, relatively unharmonized data sets. So while manufacturing is starting with these small little boxes that had tight controls, and they're trying to stack them together and then open them up to new types of analytic tools, as we're looking at real world evidence, we have kind of the opposite problem. We have these very large unstructured data sets that we need to start to structure. And the artificial intelligence tools in both cases are going to be applied to try to solve those problems. How can I use AI to take these large data sets or even multiple batches and start to look at how I can improve that batch? In a similar way, we might want to be looking at manufacturing machine learning. How can we improve the efficacy of this machine as it's going through the process, collecting data and making revisions? How can we refine our digital twins so we can start doing scenario planning for the next product, for the tech transfer that takes us to our next plant? How can we tie those big data sets together? So this concept of data governance requires that there be some structures and rules in place, and these are going to be applied to manufacturing, potentially to clinical information as well. And we can use those common data governance rules to approach things organizationally. So I'm going to go back to the story that I started with at the beginning. The foresight of the company to have some of their clinical representatives in this data integrity conversation enabled them to start to look at this data governance model. I mentioned that manufacturing and clinical were part of this conversation, but data retention expands beyond that in the organization. There are legal requirements for what I need to keep. There are legal requirements for what I can destroy. So now we have a legal group that says, okay, we have some data governance models as well. For example, how I use email to communicate from physician to patient, from physician to manufacturing, from manufacturing site to manufacturing site, might fall under some of the rules of data governance that are part of the legal structure for the company itself. Similarly, HR is probably going to have some data governance requirements. So the organization is going to have all of these data governance requirements. And one of the things that needs to happen is those need to be harmonized across the organization. Same sets of rules, exceptions can apply. They may be applied in slightly different ways, but it's going to be a very similar set of rules that are going to be applied across the board, across the organization. So this idea that data governance is kind of the overarching approach. And then from inside that there might be various initiatives, gives you an opportunity to say, okay, we can learn from each other. In this case, there's the story that I cited, there is opportunity to learn about data integrity and governance in clinical data from the manufacturing group who are feeling the intense pressure of that under current regulatory requirements. The flip side of that, there is a lot of opportunity to leverage real world evidence and how those large data sets are mined and structured and used in clinical work to see how that might apply to optimization of therapeutics for patient-specific therapies. So I'll come back to that idea that I talked about at the very beginning. One of the reasons why we want to start talking about that is because we are looking at a evolution in cell and gene therapy. And as we have these novel therapeutics that continue to move forward, they're going to create new data sets, new data challenges, but also opportunities to be able to connect patient outcomes to the manufacturing process. Something we couldn't do in large batches. It's very difficult to say, this patient got this batch of product. That's very difficult to track. But when the patient is getting their product, it becomes much easier to track, and thus allows us to leverage that opportunity. Much like with real world evidence, there's going to have to be challenges that are overcome in terms of how we track that data. Now, I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to just real quickly try to wrap up. At the moment, there is not a lot of use of real world evidence in manufacturing, nor a lot of manufacturing data used in decisions that are made about the life cycle of the product. This is going to become more common as cell and gene therapies become more prevalent, but then it's going to be carried back to other products as well. The lessons learned are going to be relevant to manufacturing as a whole, and there's going to be opportunities to connect those data sets in some interesting ways as we go forward. And I'm going to stop there, and we'll take any questions. I think we have about 5 minutes left in the session, so we can go ahead and take any questions.
We have a question from Rushi Shah. In the context of global supply chains and cross-border manufacturing, how can we address the challenge of harmonizing manufacturing data with RWE from different regulatory environments, and what unforeseen issues might arise in achieving these harmonization?
Well, from the manufacturing side, the harmonization across the regulatory agencies is already being driven in certain initiatives. The data integrity initiative I talked about is one that has relatively common standards across most of the regulatory agencies. So the data sets themselves already have some common rules. But that said, the question of how to harmonize those across the borders, I think the patient-specific therapies give us an opportunity to be able to say this patient, this product, manufactured at this place, and thus we have an opportunity to start to create a set that would allow us to make those, to sort of examine that question that you're asking. How can we look at how different regulatory requirements and different ways of manufacturing in different parts of the world might lead to different outcomes? And it gives us an opportunity to merge those data sets. Again, that patient specificity allows us to get a structured data set to take a look at those questions.
Thank you for that answer. I hope that answers Rushi's question. Once again, I really thank you for being a part of RWEsearch 2024. And thanks for shedding light on the fact that how manufacturing of data can be used to generate real world evidence data. So, really appreciate that. Thanks again for being a part of this panel.
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.